I'm Cynthia Rowland, and this is episode 125 of EO Radio Show. This is the 21st in a series of quick tip episodes focusing on the details of state registration of nonprofit corporations. In previous episodes, we talked about filing in Delaware and California, which are the most frequently used by our clients, most of whom have a connection with California. Other episodes have focused on a long list of states. These include Nevada, Arizona, Washington State, Oregon, Alaska, Hawaii, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Maine, Vermont, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, Florida, Louisiana, North and South Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, Washington, D.C., Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, Minnesota, North and South Dakota, and the Virginias. If you didn't hear your state in that list and you're not in Maryland or Pennsylvania, don't worry, we'll get to the rest of them in short order. With the help of Joe Hilliard, today we look at the basic state filing requirements for nonprofit corporations in Maryland and Pennsylvania. You can find all the prior episodes on our website or at the Farella YouTube channel, where there's a playlist just for these state filing requirement episodes. We'll work our way through the rest of the states in the near future. Welcome to the EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource. Brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. My name is Cynthia Rowland, and I'm a partner at Farella. I'm a business and tax lawyer with more than 30 years of experience advising clients on nonprofit and charity law. Through this podcast, our lawyers and guests will discuss a range of legal and business issues impacting the nonprofit world because we understand you work hard every day to make your community a better place to live and do business. Many of our programs focus on the basics, and at times we'll do a deep dive into narrow and complicated legal issues. Again, welcome to the EO Radio Show. We're glad you're here. As we discussed in previous episodes, nonprofit corporations are one variety of fictitious business entities. Others include partnerships and limited liability companies. The laws of all the states prescribe certain formalities that organizers of these business entities must go through so that the entity can be regulated and subject to legal process as a person. Since business enterprises aren't natural persons, the laws have developed mechanisms for treating them like natural persons. This is where the state filings come into play. In order for the organizers of these fictitious entities to take advantage of the protection of the laws, they have to provide notice as to the legal name, the state whose jurisdiction they are claiming for corporate organization laws, a physical address where they can be served with legal process, and certain other information. In this episode, we aren't going to dive deep into the pros and cons for where to incorporate, but instead we're focusing on the ease of formation, standardized documents that are available, filing fees, and similar matters. As with all the states we've discussed, if you do business as a nonprofit in Maryland or Pennsylvania, solicit charitable contributions there, even if just through the nonprofit corporation's website, the nonprofit may need to have a legal presence and be registered in those two states. For the details on these states, we welcome back Joe Hilliard. Joe is a senior paralegal at Farella. He specializes in formation and compliance matters for all manner of entities, and in particular charities that are tax-exempt under Internal Revenue Code Section 501c3. Prior to working at Farella, he worked in-house for several real estate development and management companies in Southern California, working on real estate purchases and vendor contracting. Welcome back, Joe. Good to see you.
So welcome. It's good to be here.
Great. So let's start in with what's become a tradition is updates on the state laws of interest to our listeners. I see there's something big this time around.
Yeah, for sure, especially if you are in Florida, and especially if you're a nonprofit in Florida. So effective July 1st of this year, Florida has enacted Senate Bill 700, and this broadly prohibits charitable solicitations from receiving or soliciting funds from individuals and entities associated with certain foreign countries. The law establishes a, quote, honest services registry, unquote, that will feature only certain nonprofits that certify that they are not influenced by and do not solicit or receive support from, quote, a foreign source of concern, unquote. Charities and other kinds of covered operations in Florida really should consider updating their contribution forms to include donor attestations. Again, that's directly from the state. They're saying that to screen for possible ties to restricted foreign sources. As always, nonprofits should also review their dealings with foreign individuals and entities to determine if the new reporting requirements or restrictions apply to them. I know we talk about looking at stuff on the federal level when we do searches on stuff. I know we've had that before where we've had charities that were donating in the Ukraine where there were issues where we checked individuals, and so this is something similar, but it's going to be obviously on the state level.
All righty. Well, that's interesting. Anything else? So that's for our Florida listeners.
We're going to talk about Oregon. And while it's not in effect yet, the Oregon House did pass their House Bill 3588. And this would amend business organization law with respect to business addresses, which is always obviously of interest and concern to us. And this bill would authorize the Secretary of State, before the filing of a document, to actually verify a business entity's principal office, its records office, listed as a physical street address and not a mail forwarding service, a virtual office, or sort of a commercial mail receiving agency. Again, sort of a postal annex, I guess, would be the example we have here down here, at least in Southern California. A lot of people use those. So the bill would provide that the Secretary of State would need to verify the address of a registered agent as not a mail forwarding service. Same thing. This is to keep your eyes on, obviously. We've talked about this before where states don't let you use P.O. boxes. And obviously some people use that as a workaround where it's like you say, this is my street address and this is Suite 35A, when in fact it's the box at Postal Annex 35A. So it's interesting that at least Oregon is looking to very specifically bounce into you and see, well, are you using Postal Annex? Are you using a P.O. box even when you're disguising it as an address? So it's something to be aware of. I know I had one here in California where we were registering a Delaware LLC here, and they'd asked that very question if they could use an address like that. And while California is not as stringent, as long as it looks like a nominal street address, this obviously in Oregon is something looking towards changing that.
Well, that's interesting. It makes me think that this is probably the harbinger of the future, since there will be, let's just say, AI tools that can pretty quickly scan these addresses for the Secretary of State to confirm that people are actually using a real address. The wave of the future. So with that, let's move on to our regularly scheduled program and talk about Maryland. How do we incorporate a nonprofit in the state of Maryland?
For sure. So in Maryland, the State Department of Assessment and Taxation, which they refer to as the SDAT, governs Maryland entity formations. They have an online portal, the Maryland Business Express, that's set up for online filings, which is their preference. They do have all their forms available, though, for printing and over-the-counter submissions. For a domestic nonprofit corporation, they have a 2-page form, which is the Articles of Incorporation for a tax-exempt non-stock corporation. Be careful here. Note that they have different specific forms for both a simple non-stock corporation and for a religious nonprofit corporation. Make sure you fill out the correct one. I admit, when I originally pulled, I actually started with the generic non-stock, and you can fill in the needed tax-exempt language, but they actually do have this form that's tailored specifically for tax-exempt organizations. So just be careful. Again, this is to mind your P's and Q's. They got me, who's a professional on it, looking at it, and I said, oh, that's the right one, and said, doesn't really look right. And I had to go back and say, no, this is indeed the correct form here. As noted, this can be a form that's filled out online and submitted, or it can be populated and signed. They've got a thing at the end where it says you can print it out and then send it in for signature versus then submitting online if you prefer to do that. Form itself notes the basics. We have our name, our registered agent, and as always, there are the quirks. The first article asks to insert the name and address of the individuals who are incorporating, and one or more individuals act as the incorporator. So the only requirement here is that they be at least 18 years old, and the instructions note, quote, the address should be one where mail can be received. It can be anywhere, even a foreign country, unquote. So they're not as worried about it. But when we talk about this, I know that when we do Delaware ones, for instance, often you sign as the sole incorporator. Same thing here in California often. So this is something where it's not any different other than the fact that it would have to include the street address here as well. The third article is their purpose clause. It does have boilerplate after the fill-in portion with our 501c dissolution language. So it is set up for that. And this was the difference between the one that was the generic non-stock versus the specific tax exempt here. The fourth article is the street address of the principal office, and it must be in Maryland and it not be a P.O. box. So we're back to that there. The fifth article is for the registered agent. It notes a corporation cannot act as its own agent, but another existing Maryland corporation can. So this is a little bit different. It can be a registered agent service like RASI or CSC, but you can also use another corporation here. Sixth article notes that the corporation has no authority to issue stocks, just one of those blanket statements, which is fine. The seventh article is really the most interesting. It asks how many directors there will be, and then also asks for the name of the director or directors who shall act until the first meeting or until their successors are duly chosen and qualified. Same thing, the instruction only notes this to be an adult and don't need to be a resident, but it's kind of interesting. You and I talk about this, I guess, like here we often use you as the sole incorporator. Whomever the sole incorporator is acting as the director prior to naming of directors. But I don't know if this would be something we would think about differently here. So,
yeah, seems like you could.
Yeah. For that, then after that, the 8th article is more 501c3 dissolution language. And lastly, all the individuals named in the first article and the agent must sign. Some states you don't have to have the agent sign. You just attest that they're going to be the agent. But here the agent will need to sign.
Interesting. Okay, so they've got 2 places for the dissolution language.
Yes.
That's kind of weird, but
yeah.
Okay.
You want to make sure you're dissolved.
Yeah, or that you know where it's going when it dissolves. So what about foreign registration of a foreign nonprofit corporation that's doing business in Maryland?
For the foreign registrations here in Maryland, there's a 1-page foreign corporation qualification, and this form is for both stock and non-stock corporations. This too can be filed online or by signing an original. Really is very straightforward. It asks for all the basics of any and all foreign registrations we've seen: the name, where you were formed, the address, and a Maryland registered agent. Do note Section E is optional to include a Maryland principal office. You don't have to have one, but if you do, they want you to put it in. And then Section 4 is a checkbox where the corporation has done intrastate, interstate, or foreign business in the state before the qualification. Generally, we would say that's a no, but this comes up, obviously, if you've started when you formed and you've got some things going on. This one will need to be signed by the president or a vice president and the agent. And then, of course, a good standing from the home state needs to be attached. Note here, too, if you do file over the counter, the forms note specifically that they must be typed, not handwritten. I think we've seen this at least once before with one of the other states here in the West Coast, but just be mindful of that.
So it has to be signed, but it can be filed online. So I'm guessing you can.
Yeah, when you file it online, it's sort of it puts the electronic signature in itself. It's only when you do it over the counter that it asks you to print it out.
So let's run through the details, the costs and response times.
For sure. So filing for domestic non-stock is $170, and they break this down. The filing fee is $150, and the organization and capitalization fee of $20 additional for a non-stock. Out of that $150 filing fee, $50 of it is contributed to the Maryland Not-for-Profit Development Center Program Fund for Corporations. So you've got that. It's required by Maryland law under that. They do it to keep everyone honest and have some more programs there in the state. And then for a foreign non-stock, it will be $100. So it's actually cheaper to register a foreign than to have your domestic in place. Although, again, some of it goes to state funding inside. So
okay, and the turnaround time?
So Maryland is a long wait time if you don't expedite. Further processing time fact: non-expedited filings submitted online without the expediting fee will be reviewed during the second calendar month succeeding the month of the filing submitted to the SDA.
Wow.
So
that's a slow boat.
You're listening to this in the first week of June, second week of June. So if we file today in June, it'll be reviewed in August if you don't expedite. Rush filing submitted online with the required $325 rush expediting fee will be reviewed within 3 hours of filing if submitted during regular business hours before 2:30 p.m. Eastern. And then rush filings outside of the regular business hours go to the next business day. And we talked about this on there. That's obviously for the online. For if you do submit to the SDAT in hard copy by mail, you can put the expedited and non-expedited. Their expedited hard copy filings are reviewed within 7 to 10 business days. So be mindful of all these requirements before you're filing there. Non-expedited hard copies are reviewed within 8 weeks. Again, that's similar to what they were talking about, the non-expedited of the next month out. 8 weeks is 2 months. So really the $325 expedite is almost something you would say has to put built into your costs and your fees when you're filing here, because otherwise it's not, unless you're really on a slow thinking about it. So
let's talk about annual filings.
For sure. So in Maryland, they have a business entity annual report that must be filed for both domestic and foreign nonprofits. And it's basically tied to what would be a traditional tax year end. It's annually by April 15th, irrespective of the formation date. However, and this goes back to the tax issue, the report itself is 8 pages and it requires a lot of financial information. So you should look at this in conjunction with your CPA. Even as a nonprofit, there are sections that need to be filled out, such as business transaction numbers, which would translate into your grants and whatever is coming in, how your workers are, and if you have any ownership of property. I did put a link specifically to this down in the show notes. So it's something to look at and think about. It's not like California where I say, oh, here's my officers, here's my money, or Delaware, or I just file it, or even, most states are very simple for this annual report, and it's not in Maryland.
Wow, it's a lot more detail. Is there a fee for submitting that?
Well, after all that work by your CPA, it's actually $0 for nonprofit.
Okay.
So there's no other back end there. And they said that it will take 3 to 5 business days after receipt for it to be uploaded and approved. So again, don't wait till April 15th necessarily.
All right. And how much detail is in this report on the individuals? Are there any privacy concerns?
So on the individuals itself, it asks for names and addresses of all the officers, including vice presidents, and just the names of all the directors. So you do have a top level there. Like I said, and obviously the financials are much bigger privacy, although as a nonprofit, those would be things you would be putting in your 990. I don't think it's too much different than that, other than the fact that, like I said, you wouldn't do that in an annual report normally.
All right. Wrapping up on Maryland, any other state agencies that the nonprofit needs to be aware of?
Yeah, so they're in Maryland. If you're organized there in Maryland or a foreign nonprofit which solicits, holds assets, or does business there in Maryland, you will be required to file an additional registration with the Secretary of State's Charitable Organizations Division. The Comptroller of Maryland governs sales and use tax exemptions, and they have a page dedicated specifically to nonprofit organizations, as well as an online application process. On the other side, the Maryland Department of Assessments and Taxation governs property tax exemptions, and they have their own separate page to do that.
Oh, wow.
So links to all three of these, the Secretary of State's Charitable Organizations Division, the Comptroller, and the Department of Assessments are all in the show notes below. So,
all right. Well, thanks for gathering all of that. So a lot to do if you're going to be operating in Maryland. Let's shift our focus up to Pennsylvania. How do we incorporate in Pennsylvania, and what are the unique things there?
Sure. So Pennsylvania has a Department of State that governs their formations. Their website uses the same basic model as the California Secretary of State, which we've discussed before, which has the login and then a sidebar menu for searches, for business searches, for online forms, and all the different general status. Unlike California, though, the forms are not available for download. They are only on the fillable. There's not an alternate menu where you can go and pull PDFs. So on the other hand, I didn't have to set up an account. I take that back. I do have an account. So I went through it, and you can look at the form as you go through without having to fill out in Form 1. So we'll talk about that, because these fillable forms do have some interesting items. For the domestic nonprofit, you will need to have a purpose added, then need to select whether it will have members or not. It needs a description of business activity, which must be a specific statement of the business conducted. Such statements as, quote, any and all lawful purposes, unquote, or all lawful activities are not sufficient and will result in your filing being sent. That's very specific in the form. And again, this is separate from the purpose statement. So you had a nonprofit statement on the first page, and then when you go to the next screen, it asks for this description of business activity. So you may end up repeating yourself a little bit here. Interestingly, it will need to name individual responsible for the initial tax reports with their address. So that's not something we've seen before.
No, that's
I guess essentially you're naming your CFO in your initial filing here. And then you need to name it does again, which again to us seems sort of backwards, but you also have to name the EIN and the end of your fiscal year with this. Usually we recommend not obtaining your EIN until you formed your entity and have confirmation, but it asks for the EIN actually in the formation of the domestic. It was kind of not what I was expecting. For the registered agent, it needs to be either the address of this corporation's proposed registered office in the Commonwealth or a commercial registered agent. We need to select whether it's stock or non-stock. Same as we've talked about, we need to name an incorporator or incorporators, include their address. There's a section now where you can add additional provisions. This is where we would put our 501c3 dissolution language. It's a screen where you just upload a document and it adds it to the document at the end. It's not dissimilar to what we do in California for certain documents as well on their system. There's a voluntary self-identification section, whether you're a small business, a small diverse business, or a veteran business enterprise, and then whether you want to learn more about state procurement opportunities. And here, too, at the end, you can choose to file online or print out and mail the filing. But like I said, there's a lot of different things that we haven't seen here before. Again, things that we would think of, not necessarily a tax advisor, your EIN, with things we would not necessarily think about in your actual formation.
Interesting. All right. So how about the foreign nonprofit that's registering?
So the foreign, again, going through their fillable system, they have a generic foreign registration statement, which is for any entity, nonprofit corporations, stock corporations, LLCs, LLPs. And then it has a drop-down box on that very first page of the fillable, and that's where you choose your nonprofit. You will need to identify the jurisdiction of formation, but unlike basically every state we've looked at, you don't need to upload a good standing or a formation document. Just say, I'm from Delaware, and here, this is that. You simply identify that home state. street and mailing address. And with that, you need to know whether the home state requires they maintain a street or mailing address here, which is interesting. So like, obviously, when we talk about Delaware, you don't have to have a street address there. You just use a registered agent. But here in California, if you were California registering in Pennsylvania, yes, you have a street address. You would say that. And then same as with the domestic, you need to have a tax responsible party, EIN, and the tax year identified in this. Again, this was something, if you're coming from another state, you would have these items in place. So it's not necessarily as big a deal as if you were doing it in state. Then you can attach additional provisions here as well. You're asked about that same optional information, and then the option to file online or print and mail.
All right. So that's a lot of detail that they ask for.
Yes.
How does the timing work in Pennsylvania?
Their business fact notes that an expected 15-day response is for normal course filings. Then they do have an expedited 1-hour service before 4 p.m. Eastern is $1,000. 3 hours before 2 p.m. Eastern is $300. And same day if you receive after 10 a.m. Eastern is $100. So not too bad. I mean, the $100 is not unusual. And then we'll talk about the cost here. The filing fee for the domestic is $125 and then $250 for the foreign. So it's a little higher than some, but not, I mean, the expedite here makes it about the same as what we just talked about in Massachusetts at $300 to $400 in total to get you out the door on an expedite, like if you need it in a week or so.
And let's talk about the annual filings and the fees for that. Mm-hmm. And then we'll go on to the state agencies.
For sure. So in Pennsylvania, all corporations, whether they're domestic or foreign, an annual report is due between January 1st and June 30th.
Oh, that's a big window.
Yeah, it's a big window. Essentially, it's the end of the year. So as long as you do it by the middle of the year, as long as you do it by June 30th would be your deadline. These reports include the business name, your jurisdiction of formation, your registered office agent, principal office address, names of at least one governor, which they define as a director, member, partner, depending on the type. So here would be a director, and then the names and titles of all the principal officers. Just like we just talked about with Maryland, it's $0 for nonprofits, irrespective of domestic or foreign.
All right. Well, that's pretty straightforward. That's a much less detailed annual report than we were talking about.
That's what we would think of as a common annual report, quite frankly. And as we noted there, obviously, at least one director and an officer will have to have their information detailed in this in terms of like privacy. So again, their name and their street address of some sort.
But not necessarily home address.
Correct. Neither of these cases did it specify home address. It just said a street address. So.
All right. So what are the Pennsylvania governing state agencies? Is there anybody else that needs to know about our new nonprofit?
If you do business there in Pennsylvania or are a foreign nonprofit that solicits hold assets, you have to register with the Pennsylvania Department of State's Bureau of Corporations and Charitable Organizations. And this is a big deal. Note that they only accept online initial filings. There's no mail-in registration for this part. And so again, in the notes, you'll see links to both their cover page and to where you can file this online. And then the Pennsylvania Department of Revenue governs all tax exemptions. They have a very good FAQ with a link to a lot of their online applications, and that too will be in along with all the links to the formation documents where you can pull up for Maryland, the PDFs exactly, so you can look at them, and then all the different Pennsylvania and Maryland websites. So
fantastic. Well, thank you again, Joe, for digging all this stuff out and compiling the show notes for everybody. It'll be very helpful, I'm sure. So with that, we'll see you again soon, I hope.
Yeah, sounds good.
So that's all for this episode. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to resources in Maryland and Pennsylvania and links to earlier episodes on the states we've already covered. As a reminder, if you go back to earlier episodes for the states we covered in the last few years, be sure to check into updated laws before looking at filing or even doing your annual report in any of those states. As I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, Farella, Braun, and Martel has a YouTube channel, and there are several nonprofit playlists covering all these podcast episodes, including the one we are building where all the state filing episodes are in one place. So look for that link in the show notes as well. I'm Cynthia Rowland, and you've been listening to EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource, brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun, and Martel. If you have suggestions for topics you would like for us to discuss, please email us at eoradioshow@fbm.com. That's eoradioshow@fbm.com. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, make a difference.